first thing I want to talk to you about, and then we're gonna pretty quickly swing it to the audience because I know a lot of people want to ask you questions, is children. You know, I had a chance actually to get to know your daughter, Susie, who's just incredible, just a wonderful person, and everybody's always said that about your kids, how down to earth they are, and having dealt with her, it's absolutely true. They're tremendous children. And so I've got an easy question and a hard question. Okay. So which one would you like first?
Give me two easy ones.
Well, the easy one, we'll give you an easy one and a less easy one.
Okay.
The easy one is, we obviously have a lot of people in the room with means who are worried about their children growing up spoiled. So what tips? I mean, your kids have come through incredibly well, given how much wealth they grew up in theory around. How did you do it?
Well, it's not what you say, but what you do. And they had a fabulous mother. And they lived the life of normal kids. They went to public schools just like their parents had and their grandparents had. And now their children and even grandchildren have all gone to public schools in Omaha. They lived in a neighborhood where we got 125 trick-or-treaters every Halloween, and there are lots of kids, and probably in terms of today's income, they probably average $70,000 a year. I live in a house I paid $31,500 for, and they saw that we were happy, that our happiness was not related to how much we spent, and that we didn't identify ourselves that way, and they had a perfectly normal childhood, and they loved the place.
Well, also when they were starting to grow up, I mean, you had some of your children up in White Plains. I mean, you weren't wealthy then. How did that change as you got wealthier? Especially that started to kick in when they started to get more cognizant. So how did that transition?
It didn't change as much as they would have liked. We didn't change, so that there really wasn't any change. I mean, I lived very much like I lived 40 years ago, and the kids had a happy growing up, and they want their kids to grow up the same way they grew up. It's really not very complicated.
Okay, the slightly harder question would be then, how did you discuss and you've been very outspoken about talking about how you transition with your children, but still, as much as you've talked about how your children will never want for anything, right. Their children will never want for anything, but still, in terms of an emotional discussion, saying, 99% of my money, I'm not going to let you control it.
Right.
How does that conversation?
Well, they feel extraordinarily lucky. I mean, they know that they're among the luckiest, perhaps 10th of 1% of people in the world. If you're not happy being in the top 10th of 1%, being in the top 100th of 1% isn't going to make any difference. They each have a foundation. About 15 years ago, my wife and I got the idea that although we're going to have one big foundation, that they should each have a separate foundation so that they wouldn't get involved in trading off, my cause versus your cause. I'm not on that foundation board. I write them a check. I write them all an equal check, and they get to pursue their own interests in philanthropy, and 3 different interests. Interestingly enough, they cooperate more because they don't have to, because one of them will see a good idea that another one has, and they'll pick up on that. But in terms of money, they've always known they'd have enough money. And if you got enough money, you don't need more than enough. And it's true, I've gotten loosened up a little bit as the years go by. They like it every time I tell them I'm going to change my will, because it generally means that I go up with them. But one thing I do, and every will I've written in the last 25 or 30 years, is I go over it with them before I sign it. I mean, I want them to know exactly what's in it. For one thing, they're executors and they have certain responsibilities, so I want them to understand it. But beyond that, I want them to feel that if my son is getting the farm and my daughter's getting a house, how I equate that sort of thing. And if there's anything that they think isn't proper, before I sign that will, we talk it over. I give it to them one day, they read it, and we talk about it the next day. So they're in on all the decisions, and like I say, they feel that they're extraordinarily lucky in life. They do not have to worry about money ever, period.
Do you guys, when you get together as a family, talk about the various philanthropies?
Well, to some extent. I mean, it just depends on who's doing what at the time. I mean, I've got a son that's very interested in agriculture, and he's trying to help people around the world on what he likes to talk about, and I like to listen. I've got a daughter that's interested in early education, and so I get exposed to what they're doing, but I don't express any judgments as to whether one is superior to the other. I don't know whether one is superior to the other, and what I do know is that they're pouring their time and effort into it, and fortunately the money gives them a chance to match their ideas with some resources.
Well, speaking of resources, let's talk a little bit about your decision to put your money with Bill and Melinda Gates. You are somebody, obviously, who's, arguably, not even arguably, definitively by numbers, the best in the world in terms of figuring out how to allocate capital. I mean, dollars don't lie, and then put it to work. And yet, with philanthropy, you basically outsourced it. How did that happen?
Well, that's true. But when my wife had a baby, I didn't deliver it either. I mean, I didn't fill my kids' teeth. I mean, Adam Smith in 1776 explained specialization of labor. He did a pretty good job of it. And I feel I'm very good at piling up money, and my wife was very good at unpiling it. I mean, it's a very simple formula. And she was going to handle the philanthropy big time, and she did during her lifetime at a moderate level. But basically, I was going to turn it all over to her to handle, and I would pile up during my lifetime. And she died earlier, and therefore I had to make a decision as to what was the best way to use a very large sum of money and get my goals achieved through other people. And there are other people that are better than I am at all kinds of things. I mean, if A-Rod's here, I mean, we're not going to get into a home run derby. So I really do believe in getting people that are younger, more energetic, but also experienced. And in the case of Bill and Melinda, have their own money up as well. And they've got identical objectives really with me. And if I can get them to do the work and I can keep having fun doing what I do, I'll do it.
And they have skin in the game.
Sure.
Well, let's talk about timing, because a lot of people, again, here have that issue too. You talked about, you were going to be a piler, and obviously, the longer you pile, I mean, nobody knows compound interest who's done it better than you in the history of the world. When do you think most people, we have a lot of people kind of in their prime accumulation years, should they be focused on piling and piling, or should they start unpiling at an earlier age?
Well, it's up to them, obviously, but if you think you're actually, and I felt this way when I was in my 20s. I mean, my wife and we talked about it a lot, and I told her I was going to compound money at a very good rate, and that therefore it made sense to delay philanthropy, not all of it, but most of it, simply because I was going to be a better compounder than most people, and it would have a greater impact on society. And she went along with that. She would have preferred that I give away more money as we went along. But I think it's an individual decision. I do think if you've got $1 million and you're going to turn it into $1 billion, then giving away the $1 million is a mistake. And I do also believe, though, that it all should get given away within in my case, a 10-year period after my death. I mean, I do not like the idea of thinking of some unborn great-great-grandchild 50 years ago, by virtue simply of coming from the right womb, making these great philanthropic decisions. So I want people that I have seen in action, who I trust. I want them to spend the money. And in that 10 years after I die, as all of it is wound on, they can't give to anything that involves endowments either. I just don't know what's going to be the situation 30 or 40 years ago. I tell people, look, I can think outside the box, but I'm not sure I can think outside that box that's 6 feet down.
Where did you come up with the 10 years also? I mean, I guess in that theory, why not while you're living?
Well, it is getting used while I'm living. I mean, this will be it was exactly 6 years ago in June that I made these commitments, and early in July, I'll give away another 1.6 or 7 billion of Berkshire stock. So it's getting done consistently throughout my life, and then when I die, what's left has to get done in 10 years after the estate's settled. There's no magic formula on it, but that basically will probably coincide pretty well with my children's productive lifetime.
Is there any philanthropist who you kind of modeled yourself on? I mean, I know you studied this.
Yeah, well, I thought about it a lot, and I did bring along, it's kind of interesting, I brought along this book, and I read this book when I was probably 25, so we're talking 56 or 7 years ago, And this is an autobiography. And the fellow that wrote this autobiography died in 1959. The New York Times wrote an editorial when he died. And the last line of that editorial is, "No other American of his time has contributed more to the welfare of his country and of humanity in general." And I will bet that not more than 10% of the people in this room have ever heard of this fellow's name. It happens to be Abraham Flexner. And Abraham Flexner probably influenced philanthropy as much as any individual in the country, not in terms of the money he used, but what he brought to the game. And he wrote this autobiography. He advised, well, he originally was picked by Carnegie back around 1912 to examine the medical system of the United States, the medical education system. He was not a doctor. He just was smart and straight thinking. And after he worked for a couple of years for Carnegie to do this, half of the medical schools closed. I mean, he actually changed medical education. John D. Rockefeller came to him. George Eastman came to him. Julius Rosenwald came to him. Finally, Louis Bamberger and his sister came and said, "What can we do with our money?" And he said, he came up with the idea for the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton, for example. I mean, this man lived a life where he essentially influenced almost all of the great philanthropists of his time. So I have seen, I've studied what both the people with the money do and what the people who are implementing the ideas of the people with the money, and it had an influence on me very early.
It's interesting, though, that you're pursuing a similar path, and that by dispersing your fortune in 10 years, I mean, you're not putting an endowment out that's going to keep your name and your name going for 100 years.
No, well, Carnegie did not go out and visit all these medical schools himself. I mean, he got Flexner to do it. George Eastman wanted to start a great medical school in Rochester, and he didn't know how to do it. He called up Flexner and said, tell me how to do it. And same way with the Bambergers. So I believe in getting things done through other people.
I want to open it up to the room and let everyone get their $3.5 million worth. I think we're gonna keep the cameras rolling. This is a reel. So we've been talking about everything's been off the record when we go to Q&A. Although I think this is such a truly historic opportunity to talk to such a I mean, in terms of your philanthropy again, in terms of the scale and the way you're going, the way you're doing it, it's truly historic. And so we're going to keep the cameras going. If for whatever reason later you say I don't want to be on camera, we'll fuzzy out your face like you're a mob informant or something. But let's keep also the questions to philanthropy as much as, I'd like to know why you're buying newspapers and things like that. You can ask more. Although that is a kind of philanthropy, I guess, in a way.
I don't think so. I keep those things separate in my mind.
But you can ask Warren privately. But let's talk about philanthropy. I will ask one question that's not related to philanthropy, and I just want to make, how are you feeling?
I feel terrific. No, I'll be around a long time.
Let's go to the room, and please identify yourself.
David Monroe.
Hi.
Oprah talked about a child earning $1,000 between $1,000 and Linda Gates spoke about the opportunity to put all the money we're putting into philanthropy is still just a tiny bit of what is needed. And I applaud the models of Mark Benioff and many others here, the 1% of the company and so on. I was wondering what you thought of a global philanthropic trust that would leverage the $47 trillion in market cap of all public companies and more private companies that were going to set aside 1% of the stock in their companies for this global philanthropic trust. Perhaps get a tax benefit in another country they're living. And it would only be allowed to be sold in small increments over, say, a period of years, so it would be no overhang on a given company. And then, of course, then it would be trouble of governance and how it's security is another issue. What do you think of that? And would you be willing to have all your companies in your portfolio contribute?
Well, I wouldn't contribute it for the other shareholders of Berkshire. In other words, I do not feel that that's my function. And so I am much more, my instincts are to go along the idea of encouraging individual philanthropy, but I do not believe in giving away other people's money. And so Berkshire Hathaway at the parent company level does not make charitable contributions. Now our individual companies do. I just don't feel that's my function. I do believe in encouraging, and we're doing it through the Giving Pledge, people to participate in philanthropy. And it's interesting, there'll be 2,450,000 people more or less that die this year. There will be about, in the normal year, there's about 0.5%, about 12,000 estates that actually get taxed, 0.5%. They will leave about 120 or 130 billion dollars. About 20 billion of that will go to philanthropy, but there'll be 100 billion that will not. I mean, and if you can change anybody's thoughts on that subject, you know, that can have a real impact. But I look at it much more on an individual basis. We've already had some luck on the Giving Pledge. This is the last thing I promise I'll read to you, but I got a letter from a woman that I didn't even know a couple of years ago, and I don't want this to show up on film where it comes from, but she said, this was about a year ago, and these people have a lot of money, many, many billions, and she said, what's your leadership informing the group and publicly announcing your intentions to donate a large majority of your wealth to philanthropy during your lifetime? Without that, I do not believe we would have been able to come to terms with donating the majority of our wealth to philanthropy instead of to heirs. While we did not quite feel, quote, right, end quote, about leaving our entire estate to our children and grandchildren, neither did we have a viable roadmap for leaving our wealth to the greater good. And then she goes on to thank. And that family has at least $10 billion. So, and they've now pledged to give away at least $5 billion. I think getting people to focus on it. Norms are going to change in this society. They've changed over the last century or 2 centuries, and they'll keep changing. And I think they will change in the direction of greater philanthropy. But I think that examples are enormously important. I mean, I can't tell you whether when I read Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth, or whether I read Flexner's book, or whether when my dad sat me down and talked to me about it, I don't know exactly what formed my ideas, but I know that you do get your ideas from the people that have gone before, and particularly the people you admire that have gone before. And that's what the Giving Pledge is about, is having people explain why they're doing what they're doing with their wealth, so that 10 years from now, 20 years from now, people read those letters and say, you know, that sounds like a pretty good idea, and I'll pick up on that. And I think that's going to happen. Not only in the United States, I think it'll spread to some extent throughout the world, because I do think we export our best ideas to the world. And I like that better than any kind of a compulsory, you know, sort of tax on people to do it.
Right up front here. Microphone.
I'm Pritzker, and I'm the president of the IDP Foundation. What I'd like to ask you is, what do you feel about the multilateral and bilateral funders, people like USA, the United Nations, that give so much money away? And you, to your point, you don't like to spend other people's money. They do that all the time. What do you feel about the fact that they give other governments, who often waste billions of dollars, aid, philanthropic support, rather than actually empowering the people on the ground in the communities that they live in?
Yeah. I'm not really totally qualified to answer that in terms of the efficacy of the 2 alternatives, but I do think that governments have a big part to play in this. I mean, private philanthropy can only do so much. Now, it can do things that governments can't do. I mean, I believe in failure in foundations. If you're not failing, you're not tackling the really important subjects. And philanthropy is so different than business. In business, you look for easy things to do. You look for 1-foot bars to step over. In philanthropy, you're tackling problems that have resisted intellect and money over the years. I mean, you're taking on the tough ones. I mean, when Bill and Melinda are trying to finally wipe out polio, that is not easy. People have been working on that a long, long time. But if there's a 20% chance they're successful, it's a terrific idea. Even that means 4 times out of 5 that, you know, the final result says failure. It isn't failure. I mean, you've got to tackle tough things, and I think that individuals can do that, but I think the organizations you name, I think that particularly if they draw money from governments to work on things that government might not otherwise be doing and that are needed by society, I'm all for them. As to the efficacy of the two groups, I tend to believe large organizations don't work as efficiently as smaller ones, but that's a personal bias. Yeah,
so I was wondering, how large do you think the impact investing marketplace is, both public and private? And what do you think can be done to increase that size, whether through incentives or public awareness?
I didn't quite get the full part of that.
Impact investing in terms of the potential.
I think it's tough to serve two masters. I'm giving you some of my personal biases on this, but I think I think it's tough. I do not. If I set up an objective of running a business as well as I can, I don't, and I've got to work through hundreds or thousands of people and getting my objectives carried out. I think giving them two different goals gets very tough. So I think it is. I think I would rather have the investing produce the capital to then have an organization totally focused on the philanthropic aspects. I'll tell you one story though, John. Jim Burke and I went up to see your dad about 25 years ago to make a pitch to raise a significant amount of money. And your dad was trivial with it, but he wasn't very interested in our approach. But as we left, he said, I'm not going to give you whatever we were asking for. But he says, I want to give you $50,000 just for your time. That 50 was worth about $250,000 now, so I was ready to drop by any day. Just
Who else for Mr. Warren Buffett? Right here.
I'm Laura Lauder from San Francisco area. I'm curious, when you speak with potential Giving Pledge participants, what are the top reasons they give you for not doing it?
There's two big reasons they give, and one is particularly understandable to me. It's if they have all of their money or 90% or so of their net worth tied up in their business, so they don't really have a lot of liquid assets. They say, how do I pledge 50% of my net worth and not, in one way or another, mess up everything that I've had planned for decades in terms of my own business. And sometimes that ties into giving into their heirs, or sometimes it's just a question of controlling their business during their lifetime. And I've got some answers for that, but I can understand that reason very much. I've talked to one fellow, for example, that really has most of his money tied up in a sports team, and that means a lot to him. And there's really no way to partition off little parts of that to meet philanthropic goals. So that's one reason. The biggest reason we get, and I think about half the time people are telling it to me with conviction, and half the time they're telling it to me to get me off the phone, but is that they say, well, I'll give up. I'm worried about privacy. They usually don't say they're worried about privacy. They usually say their spouse is worried about privacy. And they say, they say we've got young kids, and we're worried about, what will be in the paper and all of that sort of thing, or in Forbes. And so we don't. My spouse, and it's usually a wife, because I'm usually talking to the husband, and my spouse really doesn't want to get into the limelight anymore. And so if we do this, we risk that exposure. And I can tell you that of the 81 people they've got, no one has had a problem in terms of being much more exposed to the public than they were beforehand. I mean, somehow, Randall's outed me and Bill and a few others over the years, so it doesn't really change anything. But I do think that that's real in the minds of a good many. I also think it's a great way to get me off the phone without just saying I don't want to give. So those are the two that I hear the most.
When you have some of these pledge meetings, and you and I have talked about this before, you've talked about how emotional people are about the topic of philanthropy. I mean, I think that was surprising to me. I mean, what is it that when you talk to these people, what's the emotional trigger?
Well, the interesting thing, of course, is how receptive people have been, Randall. I mean, I did not dream we would have 81 people. We've not made that many phone calls, and people have stepped forward that I didn't know at all before. You know, you just heard about that letter that I received from a woman. People, to some extent, like to postpone the decision making because it's a reminder of their own mortality. I mean, it's more fun to think about what's going on in their own life today than to sit down there and focus, you know, on what's going to happen at some point. You know, it's like people, I think a fair number, there have been several presidents have died without wills. I mean, people don't get excited about contemplating their own death for some reason. and you know, but I tell them, you know, if they're 70 years old now, I mean, something's going to happen with their money. And I say, are you going to make a better decision now about what you do with your money now than, you know, your last will counts than when you're 95 with some blonde sitting on your lap, you know? So they get the point. I'm not sure I always make the sale.
Who else? We have one back here. We have two back here.
A blonde in the back.
Her lap's taken her.
I'm Laura Ariaga Anderson from Stanford.
Yeah, I listened with interest this morning.
Thank you. Question for you about the Giving Pledge. I have immense admiration for the public commitment and everything that you're doing to harness this generation of wealth in making this important public pledge. I'm a huge believer in it's not about what you give or how much you give, but rather about how you give. And I am interested to hear what, if any, initiatives you are doing in partnership with the Giving Pledge team at the Gates Foundation to empower each of the pledge takers to give in a way that matters more. Not necessarily to oppose social issues or particular causes, but rather to make the most of their philanthropy.
Yeah, we've been very careful to be totally non-judgmental in terms of when people give or what they give to. Now, we have a congregation of people once a year of the Giving Pledge, and actually maybe more often in certain areas, but once a year we get together and people talk about their experiences. They talk about their failures, they talk about, you know, their children, they talk about all kinds of subjects. People leave that smarter than when they got there. And but we are not trying to set up, prioritize in any way education versus medicine versus, you know, the line. That is up to the individual. All we are asking is that they say that during their lifetime or at death, at least half of their net worth will go to philanthropy. And I've got these three children that are doing hitting three different arenas. I don't know which one's best. They don't know which one's best. We may not know that for 10 or 20 or 50 years. I mean, there is a long, long feedback period on many aspects of philanthropy. And it's very easy. I mean, if you're going to build a hospital wing or something, you know, it's done in a couple of years and you know what you've done. But there's other things, you know, in teaching agriculture to people and that really aren't making the best use of their land or whatever. The feedback period is very, very long on some of these projects. So we do not have any intention of telling people that A is better than B, and if they want to talk among themselves, and they do, and we have these breakout sessions where we talk about different areas, they're totally free to talk about it and give their own experiences, listen to other people, and they do go away smarter, and their philanthropy is going to be better over time. But it's not going to be because of any way that we're dictating to them.
We've got another question right over here.
Hi, my name is Ryan Kavanaugh from Los Angeles. My question is, you've been so inspirational in general for all charity, for all giving. I think you've inspired certainly myself and millions of people across the world to give. What I found most difficult, relatively active in the entertainment industry in terms of trying to get those in the business to give, what I found is that it's very difficult to get younger people in their 30s, people in their 40s, to actually understand the importance of charity. And in our business, those are the people that actually do make significant money, have high net worths, whether it be in a couple $100 million, whether they make $5, 10, 15, $20 million a year. And in my opinion, those are the people that should be giving a lot and should be starting early on. And I'm usually the guy making those phone calls up on stage, trying to pull money without basically threatening them with something. I found it very difficult to get them the power of giving is what have you found works? Because other than being ready to get jobs, I don't know what else to do.
Well, what I think will work is when we get the younger people to join the Giving Pledge. When the Mark Zuckerbergs, as he has, join the pledge, put their reasons for doing it up on the internet, he's going to have an effect on people that I won't have. I mean, his peers look up to him, and I'm just some name. So it's very important to get young people to actually join our Giving Pledge, and Bill and I have tried to give even special emphasis to that, and we've gotten a number. So I think that's going to have an impact. I think that when 4 or 5 or 6 very young, very rich people that are admired by their contemporaries, when they see them sign up, they start thinking, and their spouse starts thinking, and it will have an effect. You won't see it in 3 months or 6 months necessarily, but people, they like to be admired by their peers. They like to listen to what their peers have to say, and you take on that behavior. I mean, it's in a slightly different vein, but if you go to the internet, you can look up by state where the income by state and contributions by state, adjusted gross income by state and contribution by state. And of course, one state just jumps out as giving away far, far, far more of their income than any other state, and that's Utah because of the Mormon influence. But Mormon influence is important, but there can be other kinds of influences too. And I mean, you influence certain people. There are people that look at what you do and say, maybe I ought to think about that too. And that's really what we're trying to do. And it will be cumulative over time. But I will guarantee you that what Andrew Carnegie did not only affected building libraries and all of that, it affected people generations later. What John D. Rockefeller did affected people generations later. If they hadn't existed, there would not be the same level of philanthropy as now. And there's just no question about it.
We might have time for one more quick question.
Robson from New York. I'm one of the millions or tens of millions of people that have followed you over the years and admired you and tried to learn from you. May I ask you, what is one of the bigger mistakes that you think you've made, so that you learn from that as well?
Well, the people in this room that probably know quite a few of them I've made.
Any philanthropic?
Well, it's interesting. I would say this in a general way. I learned enough about investing by the time I was in my early 20s to take care of me the rest of my life. And incidentally, I used to come over here to the New York Public Library. I worked over at 42nd and Lexington Avenue, and I spent a lot of time in there. My family thought I was a book with legs, as they put it. But I learned a lot more about human behavior as I went through life. I did not learn that by reading a book by Ben Graham or something where I was going to learn about investments. I mean, learning about human behavior, I think you really, 90% of it is by experience. I don't think you can find a lot of books that teach you about this. So I wish I'd gotten wiser about generally human behavior at a younger age, but I don't know any way really to speed up the process too much other than getting in lots of different situations with lots of different people and finding out why people do what they do. And so I don't have any great prescription to give you. I've been so lucky. I mean, I found what I loved when I was 7 or 8 years of age. So my whole life I've been able to do something I love with people I love. I mean, it really doesn't get any better than that. And fortunately, I'm going to be 82 in a couple of months. It doesn't require hand-eye coordination, or strength or anything. I just have to be able to kind of wander down to the office, and I can keep doing it the rest of my life. So it would be very sureless of me to complain about anything that's ever happened in my life. I've had nothing but good luck.
I want to thank you for two things. One, I want to thank you. I came to your office less than 5 months ago. Within 2 minutes, you accepted this idea, embraced it, and we would not be here without you, so thank you.
Thank you, Raymond.
And I'd also like to thank you. I mean, you're clearly a role model to a lot of people in this room. You're also, it's funny, my 8-year-old daughter, Sabrina, watches you in your cartoon. Warren's actually in a cartoon, The Secret Millionaires Club. Who has seen The Secret Millionaires Club? Clearly not enough of you have a 5 and an 8-year-old at home, but there's actually a cartoon on the internet with Warren Buffett. It's actually a really good cartoon. She thinks you're like one of the Muppets, actually.
Well,
It's
important. I mean, it's an important project because the habits you get, are so important. And most of us were lucky enough to be born in a household where you got it from your parents, but a lot of people don't. And through the Secret Millionaires Club, we're able to talk to kids and get them started on the right track.
She thinks you're cool, and so I told her about you, and I asked her what she wanted to ask you, and she actually said, she knows that you're giving away 99% of your money, which if you're a kid just means 100%. And she's very worried about where you're going to live. And she asked me to not ask as much as tell you that you can come live with us.
I like it.
So you always have a home in New York. Thank you for being actually a very positive role model to an 8-year-old girl.